Everything you've been told about surviving the Great White North is a lie, because while most men were busy sharpening their axes and stacking wood as high as their cabins, one man was digging a hole into the frozen earth that everyone claimed would be his own premature grave. It was the autumn of 1894, near the banks of the Stewart River, and while the other prospectors and trappers were sweating under the last rays of the summer sun to reinforce their walls, William Scott was seen lugging heavy stones and buckets of clay into a dark pit he had excavated right beneath his kitchen floorboards. To his neighbors, men hardened by years of frostbite and isolation, Scott had finally cracked under the pressure of the silence, earning him the nickname, the Mole, among the locals who watched him disappear for hours at a time into the damp, dark mouth of his cellar. They laughed over their whiskey about how the dampness of the earth would rot his floorboards within a month, or how the first heavy freeze would cause the ground to heave and crush him like a bug in a basement. Yet Scott just kept digging and lining his subterranean vault with a specific pattern of river stones and packed silt. You see, the common wisdom of the time said that if you wanted to stay dry, you stayed high. Yet Scott was doing the exact opposite by creating a complex ventilation system that used the Earth's natural insulation to fight the creeping death of a 70-below winter. While his peers mocked him for wasting precious daylight that should have been spent hunting elk or gathering timber, Scott was obsessively hauling his entire winter supply of birch and pine into that underground chamber. A move that seemed like pure insanity, given that wood usually sours and molds when kept in a hole. He didn't just stop at firewood. He began moving his entire life downstairs, creating a sanctuary that looked more like a tomb than a home, and the townspeople actually started a betting pool on which night the roof would cave in on his folly. They told him he was building a coffin, that the moisture from the ground would seep into his fuel and leave him shivering in the dark with wood that wouldn't catch a spark. But William just smiled with the quiet confidence of a man who knew a secret the rest of the world hadn't yet learned yet. As the first blizzard of the season began to howl across the tundra, turning the sky a bruised purple and dropping the temperature so fast that spit would freeze before it hit the ground, the mocking stopped and the survival instinct kicked in for everyone else. The winds became a physical force, screaming through the gaps in standard log cabins and turning stacks of outdoor firewood into ice-covered pillars that were impossible to split or burn without hours of thawing, while the smart men were out in the killing cold, desperately chipping away at frozen logs with numbed fingers and praying their chimneys wouldn't clog with ice. William Scott retreated beneath the earth and pulled the heavy hatch shut, but as the snow piled up 10 feet high, burying the cabins of the Stewart River settlement until only the smokestacks remained, a strange phenomenon began to occur at the Scott homestead that defied every law of the Yukon winter. While the rest of the settlement was literally burning through their furniture because their outdoor woodpiles had turned into solid blocks of permafrost, William Scott was sitting in his shirt sleeves in a room that felt like a midsummer afternoon despite the apocalypse raging just 6 feet above his head. The genius of his design, which the locals had dismissed as madness, was a primitive but brilliant heat exchange system where he used the constant 40-degree temperature of the deep earth to keep his firewood at a perfect bone-dry equilibrium. Because he had lined the vault with porous river stones and created a breathing chimney effect, the natural warmth of the earth actually wickeded the moisture out of the wood rather than letting it rot, meaning every single log he pulled from his underground stash caught fire with the slightest touch of a match. His neighbors, meanwhile, were facing a terrifying reality. Their wood was wet frozen, a condition where the sap inside the logs expands and freezes, making the wood hiss and sputter instead of producing heat, effectively turning their stoves into useless iron boxers. By mid-January, the situation in the Stewart River camp turned from uncomfortable to life-threatening, as the traditional cabins proved to be nothing more than drafty cages that leaked heat faster than it could be generated. One by one, the men who had laughed at Scott's grave found themselves trekking through waist-deep snow just to see if the madman was still breathing, half expecting to find a frozen corpse, only to be met by a blast of dry, aromatic heat the moment they cracked his door. They walked into a cabin that was strangely empty, only to see Scott emerge from a hole in the floor, carrying an armload of birch that looked like it had been seasoned in the desert sun for a decade. It wasn't just that his wood wasn't wet, it was actually better than the wood they had spent all summer drying above ground, because his underground sanctuary protected the fuel from the hoarfrost that settles on everything in the Arctic. The most shocking part was that Scott wasn't even using a fraction of the energy his neighbors were, because the earth itself was doing half the work of keeping him warm, a concept that was practically alien to the 19th century mind. He had essentially built a geothermal battery before the term even existed, and as the skeptical prospectors sat on his floorboards, feeling the warmth radiating from the ground, the mockery turned into a desperate plea for instructions. Scott showed them how the air circulated, how the clay acted as a moisture barrier, and why the damp earth was actually the driest place in the territory if you knew how to talk to the terrain. But just as the community began to think they had figured out Scott's secret, a massive tectonic shift to common but terrifying occurrence in the freezing northern crust. Frenton turned his underground miracle into a subterranean death trap. The ground groaned with a sound like a freight train passing through the basement, a reminder that the Yukon is a living, moving beast that doesn't take kindly to men burrowing into its skin. And for a moment, it looked like the critics might finally be right about the danger of Scott's design. Dust shook from the ceiling of the vault, and the heavy stones he had painstakingly set into the walls began to vibrate, causing a panic among the few neighbors who had sought refuge in his warmth that evening. But William Scott didn't run for the exit. Instead, he pointed to the way he had arched the stone supports, a technique he had studied from Old World miners, which allowed the earth to shift and settle without collapsing the chamber. The structure held firm, proving that his folly wasn't just a heater, but a fortress that was more stable than any log cabin built on top of the shifting permafrost. As spring finally began to touch the valley in late April, the story of the man whose wood never got wet spread like wildfire through the prospecting camps of the north, eventually reaching the ears of legendary travelers and historians of the gold rush era. When the snow finally melted, the smart cabins were found to be warped, moldy, and structurally compromised by the extreme freeze-thaw cycle. While William Scott's home stood perfectly level and dry, he had survived the harshest winter on record, with more energy and better health than anyone in the territory, simply because he was willing to look down when everyone else was looking up. His story remains a cornerstone of Yukon lore, a testament to the idea that common sense is often just a lack of imagination, and that the most unconventional solutions are usually the ones that save your life when the world turns cold. William Scott didn't just build a cellar. He changed the way people thought about Arctic architecture, influencing the dugout-style homes that would later help thousands of settlers survive the unforgiving Canadian wilderness. Today, we look back at his stone vault not as the work of a madman, but as a masterclass in primitive engineering and the sheer power of human observation over tradition. It's a reminder that when the world mocks your preparations, it asks usually because they can see the vision you're rebuilding beneath the surface. If you found William's story of survival as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive into the forgotten corners of history. We've got plenty more stories of historical rebels and geniuses coming your way. But for now, I want to know, would you have trusted a hole in the ground to keep you warm? Or would you have stayed above with the skeptics? Would you like me to suggest some visual cues or BRL ideas to go along with these specific script sections?